Now, let's head back to my virtual classroom, where every show we break down a topic or a term which is often heard in the mainstream media, but not always understood by viewers, or me, frankly. So in light of a poll which suggested that the majority of the people didn't know what the word woke means, we thought we'd get to the bottom of exactly who and what woke actually is. Today we'll be asking Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College, Eric Kaufman, exactly that question. Now, Eric, thank you very much for your time today. It's a word we're hearing more and more, this word woke. But what would you actually, in layman's terms, say it actually means?
Well, the one-sentence definition of woke or wokeness is essentially the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. So you are making sacred those groups, which means on the one hand, you see these groups as more spiritual and moral than the rest of the population with greater wisdom. On the other hand, more helpless and fragile than the rest of the population. So you are both infantilizing and worshiping these groups. As a result of that, a whole set of different policies stem from that, including the view that anybody who opposes a policy designed to help one of these sacred groups is acting in a manner that can be shunned as racist, sexist, homophobic, etc.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but would you argue that people on the left view this word as being the I guess, uplifting, the levelling up, if you will, to coin a phrase, of forgotten communities, of marginalised identity groups and all the rest of it, and people on the right actually see the word as meaning something quite different and getting into the territory of sort of cultural Marxism?
Yeah, so once you accept that these groups have a certain sacred status and offending them or even challenging those who speak in their name is in a way a sign of you being fallen. Once you accept that, then you are into the realm of advocating what I would call cultural socialism, which is a sort of weakening of the strong groups, white, male, heterosexual, and strengthening of the weaker groups, non-white, female, homosexual, etc., trans, and so on. And that entails a whole bunch of policies. It might be affirmative action. It might be speech policing. It might be firing those who say things that are offensive to the sacred groups. So, yeah, there are a whole set of what I would call cultural socialist policies that flow from this sacralization of these groups, and those have huge repercussions for freedom of speech, for scientific reason, due process, and actually for a whole host of other issues, including the ability to discuss crime, family policy, immigration, healthcare, any number of policy areas. If you accept that you have to restrict your speech so as not to offend or in any way harm groups or even to contest those who speak in their name, that really strangles a lot of things culturally, but it also has knock-on effects on a lot of real areas of our lives.
Yes, I see. We see that more and more. I mean, one obvious example would be that the fact that because of fear of being accused of racism, we actually had police groups in this country not investigating things like child sexual abuse and certain, the massive amounts of crime that went on in certain communities in Britain. But you see this more and more. And I mentioned it earlier, YouGov polling, where people in Britain actually feel that they can't voice their opinion on issues like immigration or like the self-identification debate. Where exactly do you think this self-censorship actually came from?
Well, there is a whole history. I mean, this begins in universities as early as the 1960s with this idea of repressive tolerance, that you shouldn't tolerate conservative speech. Crudely put, that comes from the mid-60s ideas of Herbert Marcuse. It gets progressively institutionalized. By the 1980s, we have so-called speech codes in a lot of U.S. universities, which have persisted to the present day, regulating what you can and cannot say on pain of expulsion and punishment. And so in the 80s, you really start to get this emphasis on emotional safety and this idea of that you may be harming members of minority groups by saying things such as anyone can make it in America, for example. So these sorts of ideas around speech harming fragile members of minority groups. It sort of starts to emerge in the 80s with political correctness and just sort of metastasizes and really builds up. And then by 2015, we get this renewed explosion as a result of the rise of social media. And you can see there's sort of a five-fold increase in the number of academics being targeted by students in American university campuses and also in Britain as well. So that's sort of post 2013, 14, 15, but the phenomena really dates from the 80s, I would argue, and arguably even back to the 60s.
Yeah, Eric, then just really, really briefly there, what would your advice be to those who are saying, well, actually, I don't like the climate of fear that this woke is creating? What would your advice be to those in the workplace today who are actually scared of voicing their own opinion? Do you think it's best to just keep your gob shut, essentially?
Definitely make yourself aware of what the Free Speech Union is doing. They can provide very important backup legally to you. Don't simply accept, in everyday speech, don't simply accept new terms like Latinx or some other term, birthing people or whatever the new term is that's being pushed. If you can resist, try to resist. But obviously, if your job is on the line, you have to be sensible. What I would say is be aware of what the Free Speech Union and other bodies like it, Counterweight, those are resources you can go to if you are fearful for your job. Try to be brave, but you've got to be realistic too, I think.
And Eric, I'd hate to make you sound, or rather take on the job of an agony aunt and sort of like I'm giving you your own sort of advice column right now. But actually the Free Speech Union and other bodies like it, I actually find it really sad and a damning sort of indictment on modern day society and culture that we actually need a union to defend our right to free expression and all of these really important key pillars of any free and democratic society.
Well, absolutely. But the problem is that what Greg Lukianoff calls the free speech culture, that belief in debate, is being eclipsed by a belief that political questions that people can disagree on are moral questions with a right-wrong answer. That, unfortunately, is more and more common amongst young people, and I'm afraid that we are actually going to have to fight for free speech. I think the government can do things. The Academic Freedom Bill is a very important piece of legislation. It's a start. Governments need to ensure that government bodies are upholding the law, prioritizing freedom of speech. But I think we actually are going to need a cultural battle to win this war for a free speech culture.
Well, hey, I tell you what, this show is going to be all over that. So Eric Kaufman, Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College, thank you very much for clearing that up for us.